When we think of the word conscious, it's this idea of being awake, being aware of your surroundings, being aware of yourself, being aware of who you are. In my everyday 9 to 9 job, I come across people all the time who can exhibit different levels of consciousness, anywhere from conscious all the way to unconscious. And oddly enough, one way to measure or determine a person's level of consciousness is to ask them if they know who they are. You ask them about their identity. And that's the medical field. But in like manner with the conscious community, you can do the same thing. You find that where a person lands on the range of being conscious, it's very much related to their knowledge of their own self and their own identity. Okay? Sa Netter, who I'm going to be talking about a little bit later, but he defines Black consciousness this way. It is a global movement which aimed to restore Black consciousness and African consciousness, which had been suppressed by slavery, colonialism, and racism. Okay? So when we look at the conscious community with that in mind, then what we're dealing with are issues surrounding identity for a specific group of people. And in this context, certainly from my talk this morning, the group of people that I'm talking about are people of African descent, Black people. Okay? So conscious community, the phrase, it's, in some regards, it's kind of an umbrella term. But within the community, or like underneath the umbrella, so to speak, there are different groups or different ideologies. Okay? What are these ideologies? That's a good question. I'll tell you. Okay, so you have groups like Hebrew Israelites. So the ideology is Hebrew Israelism. You have Moorish Science Temple. You have the Nation of Islam, or the NOI. You have the 5% Nation, or the Nation of Gods and Earths. That's their other name. You have Black atheism, or more, I think, appropriately is Afrocentric atheism. And you have African spirituality. And you also have, which is not up here, the Kemetic community. Okay? So, these ideologies might not be very well known to you, but rest assured, they all center around the individual's identity and their knowledge of that identity. Their ideologies based on identity, all of them, okay? As well, there are similar threads running through all of them as well, too. The first is that there seems to be, not seems, there is, an intense hatred for Christianity. I would say disdain. It's not disdain. Hatred for Christianity. Okay, Christianity is seen as an oppressive religion. It's seen as the white man's religion and one that shouldn't be practiced by anyone who's Black. Okay. Number two, the other similar thread that runs through all of them is that in some way, to some extent, in some regard, they see Europeans and or European culture as a foe, let's say, a foe, not a friend, okay? They see them, those two things, Europeans and or European culture, as representations of systems of oppression. So things like the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, colonialism, things like that, okay? Now, if you were to juxtapose all of these ideologies with the Christian worldview, the Christian worldview, as we know, isn't based on the identity of any of its proponents, right? The Christian worldview is based on the person of Jesus Christ, who's God, right? That he died for our sins, right? According to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose on the third day, according to the scriptures. Christianity is an ideology not based on our identity at all, okay? And so that's the conscious community in a very, 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 very small little nutshell. But the ideology within the conscious community that I want to kind of park at today is the Kemetic community, okay? This community, the Kemetic community, encourages people of African descent to return to the ancient Egyptian way of life, to their African spiritual roots, as it were, okay? So people who practice or hold to Kemeticism are referred to as Kemetics or Kemetic practitioners. So Kemeticism is the ideology, okay? You might hear it referred to as well as Kemetic science, Kemetic spirituality, Kemetic spiritual science, Kemetic tradition. It just depends on who you speak to, okay? It's not a monolithic community at all. There can be such a wide range of beliefs and ideas, and I want to be clear about that, okay? Let me be clear about this. I'm not an expert, okay? I'm not a Kemetic practitioner. Surprise, surprise, okay? But I know a little bit, and so we're going to talk about it, okay? So the word Kemet means black land, literally. And it refers to the dark soil or silt that would be left behind every year from the flooding of the Nile River. So you'd have the flooding of the Nile River and then the receding of the Nile River. And what would be left over would be fertile, dark soil, okay? So Kemet is the region that we call Egypt today. So Kemet equals ancient Egypt, okay? So you might hear me use both names interchangeably, okay? So for anyone who's interested in engaging the Kemetic community today, if you want to be able to track with them, it's obviously important to have an awareness of what they believe. But it's also important to have an awareness of what ancient Egypt believed, okay? When I started to hear and learn some of the claims of the Kemetic community, what I realized is that what we see in here today from the community is nothing like what ancient Egypt actually believed and practiced. Nothing like it at all, which I find interesting because the claim made today by many is that Black people need to make this rediscovery or this revival or this return to ancient Egypt. But they themselves don't make that return. Like, no one today is mummifying the bodies of their loved ones to prepare them for the afterlife, okay? The afterlife that ancient Egyptians absolutely and totally believed in. No one's making the return. So what are some of the things that ancient Egyptians believed? So let's talk about cosmogony. Kemet had what's called cosmogonies or creation myths. Okay, so the word cosmogony refers to the origin of the universe or reality. So we might be familiar with the word cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the structure and the changes that happen within the universe. Cosmogony is just concerned with the actual origin of the universe. So ancient Egypt had these creation myths that accounted for reality. And the stars of the show to explain reality and the universe's origin were their deities, their gods, okay? They had several creation myths, depending on where in the timeline you're referring to, and they varied from place to place, depending on your location. Because in Kemet, gods and territory often go together. So there's three major, or four, again, depending on the timeline, creation myths. The one that I want to talk about today is called the Heliopolitan creation myth, or the Heliopolitan theology, okay? This cosmogony centers around what's called the Ennead. Ennead just means group of 9. So this cosmogony centers around a group of 9 gods, okay? So remember, these are accounts for the origin of the universe and reality. So here's how the universe really started. That's kind of small in the top right. Is that right? I don't know. I get it mixed up. Over there. It's kind of small.
For us, it's left because we're facing it.
I have issues. I can explain them to you after if you want. Yeah. Okay. So, in the beginning, there existed nothing but water, okay? This primordial abyss of water. I like to explain terms when I talk. Sorry, that was my inside voice on the outside. Disregard. So primordial means that it just existed from the beginning of time, okay? So there existed this primordial abyss of water, which they called New, okay? Atum, A-T-U-M, is the God who is said to be the source of everything. He's the creator, and he came out, he arose out of New. So New existed before the creator, FYI, okay? In some accounts, he uses magic to mate with his shadow, okay? And he gives birth to deity children by either, what's the method of birth? Sneezing or spitting them out, okay? And so his children are Shu, who is the god of air, and Tefnut, who is the goddess of moisture, okay? As I said before, there's different creation myths, but there's also variations within each creation myth. And so some accounts have Atum pleasuring himself, okay? And from that action, Shu and Tefnut come from his seed, okay? Variations of the story. Okay, so Shu and Tefnut leave Atum to go establish the world, and Atum gets so worried and despondent about his children being gone that he takes his eye out to go search for them, okay? They come back with his eye. That eye then becomes known as the all-seeing eye, okay? And he's so happy about it that he starts to cry. And his tears are what give rise to humanity, to men and women, the tears, okay? Which are intentional, right? Intentional tears. Anyhow. Humanity though has nowhere to live. Remember, we just have air and moisture. Okay, humanity has nowhere to live, and so Shu and Tefnut get together. Yes, they're siblings, and they give birth to Geb, who's the earth god, and Nut, who is the sky goddess. Okay, so humans now have a place to live. We have air, moisture, earth, and sky. Okay, this is the creation myth. Geb and Nut fall in love. Yes, they're siblings, okay? And they become inseparable. So Atum is not pleased with all of this, and so he separates them, okay? Remember, they're earth and sky. So he separates them with air, who's Shu. Okay, are you guys tracking? Yeah. Okay, and so some accounts have Geb being so sad about being separated that he starts to cry, and his tears are what gives rise to ocean, bodies of water. Remember, he's the earth god. His tears are what give rise to the bodies of water on the earth. Okay, so Nut gives birth to 4 deity children: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Okay, Osiris and Isis get together. Yes, they're siblings, okay? And they have Horus, and Horus is the deity that just rounds out the Ennead, the 9 gods, okay? Again, this is one of the ancient Egyptians' explanations for how the universe and reality came into being, okay?
Your screen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Let me know. Please let me know. Okay, so let's move on to religion. Okay? Ancient Egypt can be described as highly religious. This is important because the Kemetic community today is very opposed to being associated with anything that has to do with religion. Okay? But there wasn't really a secular realm in Kemet. Every aspect of ancient Egyptian culture and civilization reflected their beliefs, from agriculture to the seasons, to the sun, the motion of the sun, to politics. Ancient Egypt had religious texts, okay? They had religious literature. They had religious edifices. Temples, pyramid, those beautiful pyramids we see, those are all religious, okay? They believed that their deities lived in these edifices, okay? They had religious festivals. They had temple priests. Priesthood was a major institution in Egyptian society. They had priests who would perform rituals like prayers, sacrifices, offerings to these deities, okay? They had beliefs about what happens in the afterlife. And they made preparations for it. That's what mummification is all about. It was this costly process, and it was a specific process to prepare for the afterlife. They had a code of ethics or morality called ma'at that they applied to their behavior, and that they believed they rewarded were rewarded or punished for. Okay, again, ancient Egypt can most definitely be described as religious. In regards to the afterlife, the conception of the afterlife was that it was simply a continuation of life on earth. So this is why pharaohs would be buried with their fortunes. They would be buried with their loved ones. They would be buried with their pets. They would be, in the case of what's called retainer sacrifices, they would be buried with their slaves and their servants for the afterlife, okay? There's a lot that can be said about that, but let's move on to what do they believe today. So I mentioned before that Kemetics aren't uniformed in their beliefs, so you have to say some, not all, when you talk about their beliefs today. But when I say some, not all, who am I talking about? These are a few people that come to mind. That's not an exhaustive list, but some people that come to my mind who are like respected and known in the community are people like Baba Haru and his wife Queen Afua. You might not know these names. Delbert Blair, Ashra Kwesi. You have Anthony Browder. You have Dr. Ben Yehoka, not a doctor. He's not a doctor, okay? You have Dr. Ben. You have John Henrik Clark, and certainly you have Jabari Osaze. He comes to mind as well. Then you have people like Young Pharaoh, Polite, General Seti. Those are just a few names. And as I said before, Sana, there's really a household name in the online conscious community if you track with it. I don't give any recognition to who you just said. Yeah. He shall not be named in anything that I do. Okay, so what do they believe? So one thing is that in the effort to not have anything to do with the religion, which again is unlike ancient Egypt, is that the Kemetic community adamantly rejects the belief in the Christian God, or really just the concept of God as most people generally understand it. Instead, some have a conceptualization of God as this idea of the one in many. Like that's you have a question?
Sorry,
that's okay.
Would you describe that belief as a sort of pantheistic?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to say that in just a few moments. Yeah. No, that's okay. So that's a popular phrase, the one in many, very popular. So the one is a divine source, a supreme being, a supreme power. It's this divine oneness that differentiates, as they say, into aspects or principles, okay? And so they call this divine source, this oneness netter or netter, and then the differentiated aspects or principles they refer to as the netteru, okay? The divine source or the netter is in everything, okay? That everything includes me, you, and Johnny. No, it includes us, it includes plants, it includes animals, like nature, everything. It includes everything. And so the belief in Kemeticism is that that we are in everything and that everything is in us. We're just simply a differentiation of the divine source. So we're God too. We're God. Okay, so as my friend here in the front said, it's essentially a form of pantheism.